Hello, and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of the Hammercast. I'm your host, Alex, the Hebrew Hammer Salkin, and joining me on this episode is Scott Kraft, who has done a number of my programs, has seen some really wild and crazy results. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about his experiences, as well as a little bit about him and his background as well. And we will jump in momentarily. One thing that I always like to remind people, if they have not already, is that if you haven't gotten my 9-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge, you are doing yourself a disservice, because I am told that it is a real game changer when it comes to improving kettlebell and calisthenics training and strength, and something I fully anticipated. It's not like I put it together and then was like, oh, I'm glad to see this is working. It is based around gait pattern movements such as crawling, loaded carries, and other things that most of us don't do very much of, but have a tendency to have a really great carryover into unleashing the strength that's already inside of us while building some more. And of course, as the name implies, it only takes 9 minutes to do. And even cooler, you don't have to put your regular training to the side. Simply start putting it at the beginning of your workouts or at the end of your workouts, and then do it for, who knows, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and just see the results that you get. Like I said, a lot of people reach out to me, tell me that they've seen a lot of improvements, and I would be remiss if I didn't want to encourage you to do the exact same thing. So go to 9minutechallenge.com, get your own free copy. That is the number 9minutechallenge.com, and it's all yours. So without further ado, Scott, welcome to the show.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And, we were talking a little bit before the show began. We talked about a whole wide array of topics. But one thing I realized that we did not talk about, maybe it's a better thing because sometimes it's easier to recount, the first time around as opposed to give like the progressively shortened, Cliff Notes version. But I'm always very curious about people's origin stories, because that I think is the most interesting thing, is figuring out how people got to where they are now with when it comes to training or life in general. So give us a little bit of that background. Were you always physically active? Were you always into sports and strength training, or is this something you discovered much later in life?
No, I was always extremely active. So probably the first place I started was with swimming. I learned to swim extremely early. My mom taught part-time at the YMCA. And so I learned to swim, and I started swimming on my neighborhood swim team when I was either 5 or 6. And then I swam through there and then through other different kind of club teams and stuff, really all the way up until I was 18. So that was the first thing I started. But in grade school, I did swimming, soccer, baseball very briefly. I got extremely bored with it. I was one of those kids that couldn't stand out there and, wait for a ball that might possibly get hit somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I played roller hockey, tennis, basketball. So a lot of stuff back there. So I started young. I enjoyed doing everything. And then once I got to my high school, which actually, I say high school, but I started in seventh grade. So I started wrestling, which was the biggest one for me. And so once I started there, that's kind of when I really got into strength training.
Now, I'm very curious, because I always hear when it comes to wrestling, there's like one of two paths that people end up going. The first one is like really high rep calisthenic stuff, and people don't want to touch any weights or anything like that. Or the other side is they will do like really heavy training, like powerlifting or maybe, Olympic lifting to some degree. Which one were you doing, or was it kind of like a mixture of the two?
So we kind of both. So I mean, my wrestling coach was also kind of the we had like a gym at high school, so he was kind of like the strength coach as well, basically. Um, so we didn't do too much dedicated strength training outside of a little bit towards the end of the season. But there'd be a whole ton of stuff just throughout practice. More of the calisthenics, squats, push-ups, things like that, kind of conditioning at the end. And then in the off season, I started going to this just really grungy gym that was like, I think it was in the basement of a Barnes and Noble. It was run by a bunch of like old bodybuilders and stuff. And so, yeah, I kind of worked with some of the guys that ran that gym. They'd put together programs and stuff that I do like in the summer.
I have to say, I think those are my favorite kinds of gyms. And periodically, like the kind where you're like, if I accidentally scrape myself on this bench, I'm going to need a tetanus shot, like that kind
Right?
of gym.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
there have been a couple of places I've gone to like that. And there's a book I read by Marty Gallagher, who's one of Pavel's mentors, and he talks about how a lot of the champions trained in gyms like that, like Dorian Yates, on the bodybuilding side of things. Did you find that the weight training that these guys helped had you do was helpful to your wrestling or hindrance, or what was your experience?
I think it was extremely helpful. And I mean, that's what I talked to them about. That's why I did it. It wasn't for, I want to get huge. I was
Sure.
like, I want to get better at sports. I want to be stronger. And so I thought it was extremely helpful. So they, just it was a good program and run it during the summer and then get into the gym and just wrestle kind of starting in fall once school kicked off.
Sure. I've talked to, remember when I was in high school, somebody who ran with my crowd, will say, wasn't mine specifically. I wasn't like, the ringleader of this like pack of
Right.
dogs, as it were, um, but it was somebody who was like friends with, some of the other people that I hung out with, and he was on the wrestling team. And I remember maybe it was a few years after, um, I don't remember exactly the conversation. I think it was something like I was saying, man, I kind of wish I would have wrestled because like the saying goes, once you've wrestled, everything else is easy. It's like one of those physical and mental activities that really you carry a lot with you. Well, his perspective was like, yeah, it's fun, but it, really messed up my knees and it hurt this and that. Did you end up walking away with like any, we'll say like joint issues or any like serious injuries, or did you escape pretty unscathed?
I managed to avoid really any serious injuries in 6 years of wrestling.
Wow.
Probably about the worst thing I had was a sprained ankle. I had a brief, I don't know what. I went to the doctor. I think maybe I might have like cracked some cartilage where my ribs meet with my sternum. That was like kind of painful, but it was just kind of painful off and on. But it didn't really prevent me from doing anything, and that's probably about it. Um,
That's very fortunate because
yeah, yeah, I was because I had lots of teammates who, separated shoulders, torn ACL or MCL. I don't remember which. Knee or shoulder injuries are pretty terrible. So
yeah, yeah. There's a martial arts gym near me that actually has wrestling as one of their offerings, which is strange because it's like usually if there's grappling at all, it's like Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Everyone Brazilian jiu-jitsu now is like taekwondo for adults, like
right,
in the
yeah,
sense that like they all do it and what have you. And this is no disrespect to either taekwondo or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, but you don't see a whole lot of wrestling. And I remember talking to a friend of mine when I lived in Pennsylvania. There was a guy who had been a wrestler in high school, and he also took on like judo and then jujitsu later. And even in his like mid 30s, he would go and like compete in tournaments. And I asked him, I was like, "What do you think is the most injurious of all of them?" Because I see jujitsu as being injurious because I always hear these stories about people's injuries. He's like, "Probably wrestling, actually." And so now I don't remember what his rationale for that was, but that's why I'm always curious because periodically I'll hear stories where people like you, like, yeah, I got away pretty unscathed. And there are other people who are like, yeah, I'm amazed I'm not in a wheelchair. So it seems like it's one or the other. Now, when you left high school and you moved on from there, did you keep up with the physical activities? Did things change in terms of like what activities you did, or did you kind of stay on the same path?
so yeah, so after high school I went to college. So I very briefly dabbled in like rowing on the crew team,
Mm,
but after having done wrestling for 6 years, the thought of getting up at 5 a.m. when I was in college to go work out didn't really sound a lot of fun to me.
no.
So I just kind of did my own thing, um, work out in the weight room and go run and things like that.
Hmm.
So that
So,
worked pretty well for about the first semester of college.
and then what happened? You just kind of fell off the wagon?
No, then I had brain surgery.
Tell us about that. I mean, as much as you want, obviously.
Yeah, so winter break after my freshman year, I went with my family to go visit my sister who did a semester abroad in Paris. And during the course of that vacation, I had to go to the hospital where eventually they found out I had a 4 centimeter in diameter abscess that was in my cerebellum that they had to surgically remove.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was the worst vacation I've ever had so far.
Doesn't seem like much of a vacation, honestly. It seemed like
No, no, it
no.
was pretty bad.
Now, and so I assume then you didn't fly back to the States. It was probably something you had done just right there in France.
Yes. Yep.
Now, okay, I've only ever been to the airport in France in Paris. Maybe there are two, Charles de Gaulle. I've been a couple of times. I've never left the place. I don't know much of anything about France or Paris or anything within it. What was it like going through a hospital experience in Paris versus the US? I mean, to me, it seems like the biggest thing would be the language barrier. Did your family have a hard time explaining like what needed to be done, or did you have doctors who were competent with in English enough to be able to communicate with you?
So a little of both. I mean, it was definitely a little bit more difficult. It wasn't for me because, shortly after I got there, they put me on morphine, so I don't really didn't really know what was going on at the time.
Sure.
But most of the doctors spoke at least some English, which made it easier. Um, so yeah, I went there. They did a bunch of tests, and then it was the second day I had surgery. I spent a few days in the ICU. I spent about 2 weeks all told in the hospital. I lost about 40 pounds, most of my muscle mass. Kind of the way it kind of affected my coordination and control, specifically more on like the left side of my body. So that was kind of fun. It took a long time, I guess, for my brain to kind of like rework itself to give
Sure.
me fine motor skills on that side of my body. Um, but the hospital was, they did a great job. I did some physical therapy, some stuff like that before they would release me. Um, so 2 weeks, then yeah, flew home, went through the airport, came back, did some more testing here. They were, I guess, more paranoid here um, in the United States. I'm not sure exactly why. So they put it's called a PIC line, just a little plastic tube in my arm. So I had this tube sticking out of my arm, and I carried this little bag that had IV antibiotics and a little pump in it that I was on for probably about another 10 weeks or so.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you were how old at this time? Probably in your 20s?
It was right after I turned 19.
Oh, wow. Okay, so still teen. Now, just as a side note here, number one, how did you discover that you had an abscess? Was it just did you mention this earlier that it was just, I obviously had to go to the hospital, but was it like headaches? Did you pass out?
Yes. So, yeah, I was in terrible pain. I spent, a day pretty much just hanging out like in the dark in the hotel. And then eventually I went to the hospital and they thought it was meningitis. They did like a spinal tap, it was negative for meningitis. They ran some other tests. Then eventually, I guess they did a CT scan and saw something. And then I went to bed. And then the next morning, they did an MRI and scheduled me for surgery. And so that's how they
Wow.
found out.
Gosh, I mean, that must have been insane. Like, you're like, oh, okay, gonna go maybe hit on some pretty French girls, and they're like, no, actually, I'm gonna be spending the next couple weeks in the ICU.
Yeah, it was
Um,
not fun.
no, I can only imagine. It must have been tough for the family too, because it's like, it's supposed to be kind of a joyous occasion. You're gonna go see your sister studying abroad, and then that couldn't have been easy for any of them to try to grapple with that and all the other plans that they had made.
Oh no, I'm sure it was worse for them than for me. I don't really remember that much.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Like on the one hand, you're kind of like, well, I guess whatever happens, happens. It's kind of out of my hands. But then their view, they have this sense of like helplessness, like outside of them, trying to care for you, and
Oh,
hoping that you're going to get the best possible care.
oh yeah, I can't imagine, having to sit there and wait like while I was in surgery. I think it took 3, 4 hours, probably at least. I mean, it was not fast.
No, not at all. So how long did it take before everything kind of started to feel normal again, and you were able to just get back to real life?
So I went back to college, and like I said, I had that tube and had to check in at the medical center like every week at my college. So that was pretty much all of my second semester of college. I didn't really do anything. I'd get exhausted walking to class, and that was about it. So maybe kind of summer after that, I took some makeup classes back home during the summer. I probably started feeling a little better. Then probably the next fall, I probably started working out again and kind of feeling more like my normal self.
Did you find that you were able to kind of get back into things relatively quickly, or was it one of those things where it just kind of, even then, it felt like an uphill battle?
It was pretty hard at first, but I think probably within a year, yeah, within a year after that, after I'd started training again, I was, well, maybe year and 3 months or so. I was in pretty good shape again. So I
Mhm.
think it probably went a lot quicker than someone who would have been just starting out from scratch. That's for sure.
Certainly. Certainly. And then as you kind of got back into the swing of things, it was mostly, you mentioned the gym. So it was, by then it was probably mostly going to the gym, lifting, maybe doing some cardio, swimming or what have you. Were you doing any sports activity after that, or was that just kind of like bygone era?
No, not really. I mean, maybe the occasional like flag football game or something fun, like or playing frisbee, things like that, just with friends at college. But I didn't really do any official sports after that.
Gotcha. And so no, it was even like just recreationally, it wasn't all that common. Like you didn't go to college for a particular sport and you
No,
weren't playing them
no,
recreationally. Yeah.
no.
Now, so I'm guessing then this part will be fasting forward. So you've gotten a pretty good head start for the most part, with the exception of the hiccup with brain surgery and recovery and what have you, kind of in the middle. So did you keep up with the training you had been doing? And then when exactly did you discover like kettlebell training? It sounds like you were doing calisthenics already as a wrestler. When did you discover the kettlebell in particular?
Yeah, so I mean, I kept training as much as I could. Most of my 20s were pretty rough in terms of work with a extremely difficult and time consuming job. So I would work out a bit occasionally, but it mostly be go for a run and then a quick workout with no more than maybe a pair of dumbbells and body weight at home kind of thing. I didn't go to a gym or anything like that. In terms of kettlebells, I probably started early 30s. They kind of just became so popular. You'd see them worked in. Not necessarily anything super specific, but kettlebell swings, kind of overhead presses, things like that with kettlebells were becoming, I think, pretty popular in just about everything, just as an alternative to, barbells or dumbbells or whatever. So
Certainly.
I started with there, but I probably didn't really get more into them till about 3 or 4 years ago or so. I bought and read uh, Simple and Sinister, and that's probably when I really first started getting into kettlebells. I started doing that for a few months.
Very nice. So this was something somewhat recent in time, then, is what it sounds like, because when I discovered kettlebells, it was definitely not popular. Nobody knew anything about this. Was like an '08 to give
Oh yeah.
date me a little bit. So yeah, it was like if you mentioned a swing, people are like you mean like a swing set, like they just didn't. I remember one time writing about bragging about a clean and press PR that I had hit, and I put it on a Facebook post. And my aunt told me at a function maybe a week or so later, she's like, "I thought you were talking about like cleaning and pressing your shirt." Like I did, she had no idea it was an exercise. So
Oh,
this
that's
just,
great.
yeah, I just thought that would be. It's a funny contrast because I talk about clean and press on Facebook, and I don't know, let's say '09, 2010 maybe. She has no clue what it is. And but at this point, it was already a part of the zeitgeist, and you had already started to integrate it. Then you discovered Pavel and Simple and Sinister, and then what was the progression like from there? Did you do that for a while, and how did that go?
I went great. I mean, I did it for a few months with some pull up stuff and a little bit of other things for the most part. But I did that. It worked well, and then what did I do from there? Kind of started doing something else a little different from there, and then that's around the time when I found you after following some of the strong first people. I think mostly through Instagram is probably
Hmm.
where I found a lot of stuff, and then found you. So then,
Right on. And so when you started following my stuff, like what do you remember in particular, like what you started with? I assume I'm trying to think of even like would this been in the 9 minute challenge era or would this have been the 99 workouts era?
I see. I was going to ask you about that. It was the 99 workouts. It was
Oh,
not the
gotcha.
9 minute challenge. So yeah,
Gotcha.
I found you, and I was like, hey, free workouts. So I signed up, and then I started getting emails. And then it was right around when you released the Exodus 2.0 program. And I was like,
Hmm.
oh, that sounds great. I like these things. And so then
And what was your experience like with that? Because I'm always curious whenever somebody starts up a challenge, particularly like Exodus. For those of you who don't know, Exodus is like um, focused around certain gait pattern movements like carries and dragging weights and stuff like that. And the original one, people told me was much more brutal. It was like very direct, very to the point, but it was like a 20-minute workout, and it was. I, some people from the olden days were like, "Yeah, that was like really, really nasty." But I made 2.0 something that was just nasty enough that you could feel like you could do the next day. I'm curious what your experience was like with it because this is the first time hearing of it.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, you got me with the sales pitch. It was great. So it was like crawls, carries, which I love both of those, and then it was
Yep.
drags and marching, I think, which I hadn't
Hmm.
really done much of, and then it was like 10 minutes, 10 minutes a day. And it's like you can do it at the end of your workout. So that's exactly what I started doing, is just kind of adding it in at the end of the day. Honestly, I loved it. It was great. It's kind of a little bit of conditioning, and then just a lot of strength that you don't really, it's a little different, at least it'll fill in some of the gaps, kind of, especially the dragging. I'd never done any kind of dragging before, and man, it gets difficult.
Yeah, that's one of those things. It really doesn't let up. I think, for instance, with crawling, you can kind of learn to relax a little bit. With the carries, to some degree, you can do the same thing. But when you're dragging, it's like think about like your entire body's planked, or you're propping yourself up on your hands the entire time. There's really no moment of repose, and it's always a lot tougher than people think. At least when they look at it initially. Did you notice any difference in terms of like your performance in your regular workouts? Like, did those start feeling stronger, easier? Was it just that your conditioning, like you felt like you had more wind, or like what in particular did you notice about those?
I think more probably from a just kind of conditioning standpoint.
Hmm.
With that, I don't specifically remember. I'm really bad about tracking things like the weight I'm using and what I'm doing in workouts. So I don't know, but I have made some serious strides in the last few years, which has been great, which I'm sure helped.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, uh, that's one of the things that actually I think is a little bit less important is the weight and the number of reps. I think what most people, particularly if you really kind of nudge them on it, they'll be able to narrow it down. That what they really care most about is like what they can do outside of their training. Like I always like to kind of liken it to Indiana Jones in the Last Crusade. He's like, I don't know if I'm sure you've seen it. You're
Oh
like,
yeah, of course.
everybody in our generation has seen it. I've
Yes,
seen
of
it like
course.
probably 2, 3 dozen times. Like that was like it was always on TV when I was
Yes,
in
it
middle school.
was.
Yeah. But I don't know what the other ones were on like very periodically. I don't know why, but it was like, yeah, The Last Crusade. It was like every other weekday you could find some channel playing it. Um, but there's a scene at the end, spoiler alert for anybody who's not seen it. It came out in '89, so really you should have watched it at this point. But there's the knight tells Indy that he's now immortal as long as he doesn't pass beyond the Great Seal in the middle of like the kind of the entrance area. So like that's the price of immortality essentially. And so it's like people don't want that from their fitness where they're like, I'm really fit and strong and everything like that, provided I'm in my gym. And then the minute I
Right.
leave, I have to go back to being regular. So are there any things now you mentioned Exodus, but I know that there are a few other things that we've talked about beforehand, like Necronodmicon, kettlebell mastery. Some of these other things in particular, I know we mentioned a little bit. They seemed like they gave you uh, like superpowers outside of the regular. I don't know if that's the right term. We'll just use it, but abilities outside of your regular training that you are able to take with you elsewhere. So, um, any, like, let's start with like kettlebell mastery in particular. Um, very in-depth program. What are some of the frustrations that helped you to overcome, or questions that it helped you to answer about getting full body strong with a kettlebell?
Yeah, so that was the first real bulk of the kettlebell work I've kind of done. I hadn't really done any kind of like snatching or high pulls or things like that until that point. It was mostly just kind of swings or get ups and pressing.
Mhm.
So one, it was just a great introduction and a great way to learn all the moves. And then you put in enough uh, accessory work, I guess to say. Definitely noticed some big improvements in terms of mobility, especially for squatting, things like that, which I definitely still struggle with, still need to improve. But that was a significant improvement in a pretty short amount of time. And there was definitely a moment I remember when I'd just been doing kettlebell mastery. I didn't have time to do much outside of that in terms of cardio and things. And I remember one
Mhm.
day I went out and ran a 5K and was like, wow, that was a lot faster than the last time I did it 3 months ago when I was running regularly. So I definitely
Nice.
noticed some carryover to mobility, conditioning, and definitely improved strength as well. And just learning the correct way to do a lot of this stuff.
No, that's especially cool. I always feel like, the ultimate deal that people want is to get more than what they paid for, So it's like, this is a dumb example, but like, whenever I crack open an egg and there are two yolks in it, I'm like, this is gonna be a good day, like totally wasn't anticipating the second yolk. But I think it's very much the case also with your training. Again, you want, using the Indiana Jones analogy, you want your training in general to give you more than just what you practice. So it's one thing to say, oh, I can squat better now, but if that squat allows you to, play with your kids with greater ease, wake up in the morning without feeling like your back is, stiff as a board, and all these other things, like the stuff that happens to you in the real world is what's especially cool. And even if you don't need to run a 5K per se, the fact that you can do it more quickly and without training for it is that's pretty nifty.
Oh yeah, it was great. I was just like, wow, that was cool. Was
Yeah.
not expecting
No,
that.
not at all. Not at all. And now another one we mentioned, which I mentioned earlier, it was surprisingly popular for how convoluted the name was that I gave it, Necronodmicon. I want to explain too, because people are like, nobody seems to understand. Some people got the reference. I had some people say, like, I picked it up just because I love the movie Evil Dead. And there was a horror fiction writer named H.P. Lovecraft, who wrote a book that, within it, there's a book called the Necronomicon, and it's supposed to be the Book of the Dead. There are all these like spells and witchcraft or something like that. I've not actually read his book, but it's like enough of a pop culture reference, and I like puns and plays on words, that I was like, oh, Necronomicon. Why not? I'll just toss that in there. And I've had so many people like, I didn't even know how to say it or whatever, but they had some great results in terms of their how their neck felt. And I didn't realize that you had done it, but you were mentioning earlier that you had done it, and I'm curious what some of your experiences were from doing it.
Yeah, honestly, that's probably up there with some of my absolute favorites of what I've done from you, which seems a little strange, but it's pretty powerful. If you're not training your neck, you really should be doing something. So yeah, I'd never done neck nods. I mean, I'd done a whole lot of all kinds of stuff, bridging up on my head. I had a huge thick neck back in the day, but I hadn't done any neck training since I probably wrestled, I would imagine. And it definitely helped with, I've had kind of a neck shoulder. I'm not even sure what is the primary cause injury thing.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of go together, neck pain, shoulder pain, and training my neck, doing the neck nods definitely seemed to alleviate that quite a bit. And it's something I've tried to work in and probably need to do a better job of, working in regularly, just because it's actually extremely difficult, some of those variations for your neck, and it really helps just with posture and feeling good all over.
Now, yeah, that's something that a lot of people, like you mentioned, they don't think about at all. And like, if whenever you have a weak link in your body, it's almost always going to end up causing you issues eventually. And probably the last thing most people think about is training their neck for, reasons that that would be pretty obvious if you talk about doing neck bridges, which, huge in the wrestling world, but
Mhm.
people are rightfully a little bit skittish about loading up their head and their neck because, like if you can do it, great, but you don't want to find out you can't do it. It's like one thing if you hurt one wrist and you've got the spare, you can do stuff with the other hand. But if you hurt your neck, people don't realize just how much of an impact that has on other parts of the body, Um, and the nice thing too is being able to train your neck and get it stronger while with stuff that is not going to put your head under load, meaning you don't have to put any weight on your head or on your neck, and you can still get it stronger. And you mentioned, postural benefits. I'm curious about the shoulder in particular. Did you find that, like, as a result of some of this stuff, your shoulders just felt like they wanted to play ball a little bit more often? They just felt like they were in better condition, or what did you find with that?
Yeah, it definitely helped kind of loosen things up, definitely alleviated some pain. There's still room for improvement, let's say, but there was improvement, that's for sure.
That's excellent. That is very cool. Yeah, and I'm glad to hear that you really liked it as much as I did, because I kind of figured, okay, look, people, there's going to be a very specialty challenge. People aren't probably going to care that much, but surprisingly, a lot of people really, really, jumped on it, which was not at all what I was anticipating. I thought it was going to be something that only like the most hardcore original strength nerds were going to want to do, or maybe former wrestlers. In this case, I mean, that's you, so that certainly worked out in that regard. But yeah, a lot of people really dug it, so I was very happy about that. Um, and when we're done here too, I'll give you some secret sauce. I can't tell you on air. I've got to give you the secret sauce for some other shoulder stuff that I think might help you, also pertaining to the neck. So I'll give you those details momentarily. But before we go on to that, there was one other thing that we were talking about. There was, I know you mentioned Necronomicon, Kettlebell Mastery, Exodus 2.0. Anything else in particular that sticks out from the journey of doing any of my courses or programs or anything like that?
January was also great. Speaking of shoulders and shoulder health.
Absolutely. Anything in particular you noticed about that? I always felt like if you wanted something for like the full upper body that you could do daily and it wasn't going to overload your training, like Hanguary and Necronodmicon would be two good ones, because they're covering some ground that most people don't really think about, and they're also making sure that you get mobility and strength at the same time.
Uh, yeah, that's the main thing was yes, both mobility and strength, grip strength, shoulder strength, kind of mid back or upper back, depending on what we're doing. With the variety of exercises that were kind of in there, and it's just brutal when you're 200 plus pounds. Pretty much all the body weight stuff is, but hanging especially.
Oh yeah. Pavel mentioned this was probably like a little over 10 years ago. He had it was the first and last Naked Warrior Workshop is what it's called. And I'm glad they changed the name, because I feel like, that it just
Hey
it needed a little
guys.
bit of work. It's like, people show up in their birthday suits and it's like, no, 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 you got the wrong idea. This is not that kind of certification. Um, but now I think it's called Strong First. Well, Strong First Body Weight, and very much a lot of the same material. But he said, big guy, like uh, calisthenics tends to favor smaller people and barbell training favors larger people. But if you're a small guy who can get strong with barbell training, or a big guy who gets strong with calisthenics, you're going to be like abnormally strong for your size. And that's one of those things that I think the nice thing about, whether it's just simple hanging or even just totally basic calisthenics exercises, if you're a big dude, 200 plus pounds, you stand to gain a lot more from calisthenics than most people would really think.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you can make some serious improvements. I definitely. Oh, speaking of, yeah, I did bodyweight badass earlier this
Oh
year
yeah.
because I was freaking out because summer started and I was running around with my kids and I was like, oh my gosh, I haven't been to the gym in like 3 weeks. What do I do? I was like, okay, I can do this. I don't need any equipment other than what I have at my house. So I started doing that one. There was definitely a point, probably most of the way through the program, where I was like, wow, I'm looking good. I must have lost some weight, and I stepped on the scale and I was heavier. So I
Really?
lost some fat and put on some muscle, but I was just kind of like, whoop, didn't expect that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great example too of why you can't always just look at the number on a screen, like on a scale, and then assume that like that like that's the ultimate change. Because most people, if given a like if they're like, look, you're gonna weigh 50 pounds more, but you're gonna look
Right.
like incredible, they'd be like, okay, who cares? 50 pounds more, whatever. If I look good, I can move well, and what have you, I'll take it. So no, that's awesome. I had this is the first time hearing it, so
Yeah.
I always
Yeah.
like to hear stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
And
No,
then
I was surprised for sure because I felt like I must have lost some weight.
yeah, no, that's even better. Think about that. Like, if you weigh even more and you feel like you weigh less,
Right. Yeah.
that's a huge jump in strength for the most part.
Hmm.
And then I'm remembering you mentioned also summer swole. So given that that's kind of on the same wavelength as like you want to look good, when especially if you're going to be outside, maybe shirtless or in the short sleeve shirt or whatever. How did summer swole kind of like? Uh, what did you find that it? How did it dovetail with bodyweight badass?
Yeah, it worked really well. I did. Yeah, I did bodyweight badass and then went right into summer swole. It just worked extremely well. I don't know that I noticed anything super specific doing that one, but I felt great. I felt like I looked good. Definitely, like I said, I definitely put on a little bit of muscle mass and still continuing to lose some fat and just trying to get exactly where I want to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can't get much better than that. I think, well, number one, there's a nice contrast too between doing something very body weight focused and then something very kettlebell focused, or vice versa. It always feels like, ideally you should be able to use the two together. But if you ever want to go like hardcore in one direction or the other, it does feel like you end up getting like hidden gains that you would not have expected. So I think that those are some pretty good programs to do back to back. Absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, definitely noticed increase a lot of push-ups that definitely increased there, and then pull-ups and in terms of calisthenics, there was some improvement. So happy
Nice.
with
That's all,
that.
especially again, if you're like 200 plus pounds, like any improvement in pull-ups is going to be like, it's going to show on your back for sure. You're going to be like busting out of your shirts.
Yeah, I'm trying to get down to 220.
Well, now's the time, as of the time of this recording, we're like right at the very tail end of 2022. So 2023 is going to be the year you get that. You're going or maybe you don't get below 220, but you're going to feel like you are, and you're going to be like just that much more jacked and shredded. And you're going to be like, you know what? We can wait for 220. That's totally
Yeah,
fine.
I don't want to do that because I have to buy all new clothes.
That is true. Yeah, that actually does become something that you have to consider at a certain point. So, well, let me know how that goes. I mean, hopefully, I don't owe you a big, bill for a bunch of new, clothes in the very end. But if so, I will totally take that as a nice compliment and testimonial. So, it's a win-win situation, as I
It
say.
really is. I mean,
Absolutely.
it's been a
Now,
great year
if
for training.
Oh yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, one of the things that I think as you get older, you don't think so much in terms of like, this workout was great or that workout was great, but like what you just said, if it's a good year for training overall, you've got a number of things that you've done that turned out to be successful, got some great results, you know, maybe you got people rubbernecking as you're walking down the street, your old friends are seeing you and they're like, you're like the star of the show. They want to know, what have you been doing? Are you on steroids? That's always a nice, compliment to get. And of course, I've had other people tell me that, their wives are always very happy once they finish one of my programs or challenges, as they start to, beef up, lean down, and, the ability to just toss around some weight always looks cool too.
Yes, yeah, I've been enjoying that the last couple of weeks. I've really been feeling strong and moving some weight around. So it's nice. Yeah, it's a good way to end the
Excellent.
year and healthy, pain free, able to
Who could
move.
ask for anything more? That's what I say.
No, I really can't.
Now, if people want to follow your training online, if you put any of it up there, where is the best place to go? Would that be the Facebook group, or do you have like an Instagram or Facebook page where you kind of keep people updated with this sort of a thing?
So honestly, the Facebook group, your group, I probably, I post there occasionally. I need to do that a little bit better. That's probably about it. I do have an Instagram account, but I don't think I've ever posted anything there. I just follow people.
Uh-huh.
Maybe one day I'll actually start posting some stuff, but
You're certainly welcome to. I mean, one thing I'll tell you this, I'll tell you, as somebody who is an unfortunately frequent user of social media, is that it can be very addicting. So don't feel like you're obligated to do that. But if the Hebrew Hammer's Hidden Hideaway, the Facebook page, if that helps you to stay accountable and, follow people who are doing similar programs and getting great results, then that should be considered totally sufficient. Don't think that, you got to become one of these influencers or what have you. It's a long uphill battle, and but if you do, I will make sure that I update the comments or the show notes so that people can follow you. So you let me know which fate you end up choosing. But until then, people can follow you and your posts and your updates in the Hebrew Hammer's Hidden Hideaway on Facebook.
sounds good.
Excellent. And well, I really enjoyed this chat. I like that we got some Indiana Jones references in there. We got
Always good.
yeah, some other pop culture references. I feel like that always makes for a good conversation. It's much more interesting, I think, than just, you know, geeking out about iron training. I love it as much as anybody else, but got to be able to make it interesting to real life. And if you can make analogies to Harrison Ford movies, I say why not? Go crazy. Except American Graffiti. That one we don't need to make any reference. So, well,
Enough.
anyhow, I think I'm sure you've got other things you're going to have to do with the remainder of your day. So I want to say thank you very much for coming on the Hammercast.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
It's been a pleasure. And folks, as always, have fun and happy training.